Imagine this. You wake up already tired, your calendar is packed, your inbox overflowing, and still you feel like you're not moving forward. Sound familiar? Welcome back to the Grow Leap Academy podcast, where we break down powerful ideas from best-selling books to help you grow smarter, faster. And today, we're tackling one of the most quietly life-changing concepts out there, essentialism. We're diving into Greg McKeown's book, Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less, a guide not just to productivity, but to clarity, focus, and freedom. This isn't about doing more in less time. It's about doing only what truly matters. It's about learning to say no, even to good things, so you can say yes to the right things. It's about escaping the trap of being busy, but not effective. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, overcommitted, or just stuck in the noise of modern life, this episode is your signal to stop, breathe, and get laser focused on what really matters. Let's jump into essentialism, and start the journey toward a life of less but better.
Okay, so you know that feeling where you're just like completely swamped, like a million things on your plate, saying yes to everything, but not actually, making progress on the things that really matter.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like a constant state of overwhelm.
It is, right. So we're going to dive into a concept today that might offer some, a way out of that. It's called essentialism, and it's all about figuring out what actually matters, what you're uniquely positioned to do really well, and then, making it actually happen, like almost effortlessly.
Effortlessly, like magic.
No, not magic. More like just getting rid of all the stuff that gets in the way and focusing on the things that have real impact. So we're looking at Greg McKeown's book on essentialism. It's got personal stories, business examples, strategies. So we'll try to pull out the core ideas, the stuff that you can actually use, in your own life.
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with this, right? Like feeling busy, but not necessarily productive.
For sure. So the book starts off by looking at what happens when we don't embrace essentialism. When we try to do it all. There's this story about this person at a company who just couldn't say no to anything. Every request, every meeting, they were there. And the result, totally burnt out, stressed to the max, and their work was actually suffering because of it. McKeown calls it majoring in minor activities.
Right. And that's such a trap, right? We think being busy means being productive.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case. The known essentialist, as McKeown calls it, they operate under that assumption. Like just doing more will automatically lead to better results. But often it just leaves you feeling exhausted and like you're not really getting anywhere.
Exactly. So essentialism is the opposite of that. It's not about trying to fit it all in. It's about accepting that you can't do it all and making choices, tough choices to say no to things that seem good so you can say yes to the things that are really important.
Right. Saying no is this crucial skill for an essentialist.
Yeah.
And McKeown has a really interesting personal story about this in the book. He talks about the day after his daughter was born, obviously, incredibly important moment. But he had this client meeting and there was this pressure to be there, the feeling that he had to go.
Oh, wow. So the pull of work even in a moment like that.
Exactly. And he ended up going to the meeting. But here's the thing. His colleague had even emailed the client beforehand saying something about how they, the clients, would respect his decision to be there. But McKeown, when he saw their faces, he realized there was no respect, at all. Just this, awkwardness. He felt completely out of place, and he realized he'd gone out of obligation, not because it was actually important.
So he missed out on this precious time with his family, probably didn't impress the clients anyway.
And guess what? The book says that exactly nothing came of the client meeting.
Oh, wow. That is a powerful illustration of, the cost of not being clear about your priorities. And sometimes it feels like success itself can make it harder to stay focused. The book talks about this paradox of success. What's that all about?
Yeah, so it's kind of a weird cycle. McKeown breaks it down into these 4 phases. So the first phase is, you're clear about what you want, and that clarity leads to success. You achieve something great.
Okay, so far so good.
Right. But then, because you're successful, more opportunities come your way. People see you as capable, so they want you to do more.
Yeah, like your inbox explodes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the third phase. You get spread thin trying to keep up with all these new opportunities.
Yeah.
You start saying yes to things that aren't really in line with your core strengths.
Mm.
And the last phase is where it gets tricky. You actually get distracted from what should be your most impactful work. The very success you achieved starts to, like, undermine the focus that got you there.
So it's almost like success, if you're not careful, can become the thing that, like, holds you back.
Right. And it's interesting to connect this to Jim Collins' work in How the Mighty Fall. He talks about the undisciplined pursuit of more as this, like, a major factor in why companies fail. And it's the same for us as individuals. We chase every shiny object and lose sight of what really matters.
So the key takeaway there is stay vigilant against the undisciplined pursuit of more. Okay, so how do we break out of that cycle? It seems like it all comes down to making conscious choices. And the next chapter in the book is called Choose. Makes sense.
Yeah, and it really emphasizes this idea of personal agency. Like,
Yeah.
we have more control than we sometimes realize. McKeown talks about his own experience. He was halfway through law school, and he had this realization that it just wasn't right for him. He'd gone in with this idea of keeping his options open, but it actually left him feeling like straddled, not excelling in law, not pursuing his interests in management, not focusing on his writing. It was like being half in, half out of everything, which is, not really a recipe for success.
Right. You're putting in the effort, but not getting the results you want.
Exactly. And it highlights this big difference between the non-essentialist and the essentialist. The non-essentialist says, I have to, which feels like you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But the essentialist says, I choose to. It's about taking ownership.
It's about remembering that you have agency, that you're the one making the decisions, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Right. And I think this also challenges that idea that we always have to be working harder, that hustle mentality.
Mm-hmm.
The book even asks if maybe doing less but thinking more strategically could actually lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Like maybe it's not always about just putting in more hours. Maybe it's about being more deliberate about where you put your energy.
Right. It's about recognizing that for people who are already capable and hardworking, there's a limit to how much more effort will actually help.
Yeah.
Sometimes that extra effort is just being misdirected.
It's like you're pushing a boulder uphill, but you're pushing in the wrong direction. So making those choices, that often means saying no. And it brings us to the idea of strategic trade-offs. The book uses Southwest Airlines as a good example of this.
Yeah, so Southwest, under Herb Kelleher, they were so intentional about the choices they made. They didn't just become a low-cost airline by accident. It was a strategy. They chose point-to-point flights, no meals, no assigned seats, only coach class. They were saying no to a lot of things that other airlines considered like standard.
So those weren't just random cost-cutting measures. They were strategic choices, all in service of their core mission of offering low-cost travel.
Exactly. And Kelleher had this great quote about it. He said, you have to look at every opportunity and say, well, no, I'm sorry. We're not going to do 1,000 different things that really won't contribute much to the end result we're trying to achieve. They had this laser focus on what they were and what they were not.
And the book contrasts that with Continental Airlines and their Continental Light. They tried to compete with Southwest, but they didn't fully commit, did they?
No. They tried to, straddle strategies. They kept a lot of their existing business model, but tried to incorporate some of Southwest's low-cost approach. But it didn't really work. And there's this quote from Michelle Porter that's relevant here. He says, a strategic position is not sustainable unless there are trade-offs with other positions.
So Continental Light ended up compromising their service quality, confusing customers because they didn't make those clear choices like Southwest did.
Exactly. And it cost them a lot of money.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big lesson in the importance of focus in making those trade-offs.
Okay, so it's not just about business strategy, right? The book gives examples of how essentialist thinking applies to our personal lives too.
It does. There's this story about some parents who are really focused on helping their son get into Harvard. And they realized that to do that, they needed to streamline his extracurricular activities.
Right.
So any activity that wasn't going to be his big thing, they'd have a conversation and pull him out of it.
So it wasn't about forcing him to do things he didn't want to do. It was about helping him focus on the things that were actually going to help him achieve his goal.
Exactly. And then there's this other story about newlyweds who were asking this older couple, the secret to a good marriage. And the older couple said that they made this conscious decision early on to not join any clubs or take on too many social commitments. They wanted to prioritize spending time with their children.
Wow, that's a big trade-off, like all those social opportunities.
It is. But for them, it was worth it. They said
Wow.
their children ended up being their closest friends.
So yeah, it's all about recognizing that trade-offs are necessary. And it's about making those choices in a way that aligns with what's most important to you. All of this, the focus, the choices, it really points to the need for space, right? The book
Yeah.
talks about creating space to concentrate.
Absolutely. We live in this like constantly connected world. Distractions are everywhere. And the book tells this crazy story about an executive who had to complete this big project. And he was so overwhelmed with interruptions at work that he literally checked into a motel for 8 weeks to get it done. A motel with no internet.
That's dedication.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But it shows how essential it is to have that space where you can actually focus,
Sure.
without all the noise and distractions.
And it's not just about avoiding distractions for like specific tasks. It's also about having time to think more broadly, to learn. The book talks about Bill Gates and his Think Week.
Right. So Gates, he started this back in the 1980s. Twice a year, he would basically go off the grid for a full week. He just read articles, books, think about the big picture strategy. He was known to read something like 112 articles in a single week. And he kept doing this even as Microsoft was growing like crazy.
So he was prioritizing this time to reflect, to learn, even when things were super busy.
Exactly. And the book even suggests that we can do a kind of mini think week in our daily lives, like maybe spending the first 20 minutes of the day reading, just to kind of center yourself and get some perspective before diving into everything else.
That's a really cool idea. So once we have that space, how do we get better at actually identifying what matters? The next section of the book is about look, seeing what is essential.
This is where it gets really interesting. The book talks about adopting the journalist's mindset. And there's this great story about Nora Ephron's journalism teacher, Charlie O. Sims. He taught her that being a journalist isn't just about writing down the facts. It's about figuring out what the point is. Like, what's the one piece of information that really matters?
I think there's an example about like a school announcement, right?
Yeah. So they had this exercise where they had to analyze this school announcement. And all the students, they were focused on the who, what, when, where. But they missed the most important part. There was going to be no school on Thursday.
Because they're so focused on the details, they missed the big picture.
Exactly. And Ephron realized that it wasn't enough to know the who, what, when, and where. You had to understand what it meant and why it mattered. And that's so true for our lives, too. We could be swimming in information, but if we don't know what it means, why it matters, it's not really helpful.
And sometimes we can get so focused on the details that we miss the overall context. The book talks about Eastern Airlines Flight 401 as an example of this.
Yeah, that's a really tragic story. So the flight crew, they were fixated on this faulty indicator light for the landing gear. It's just a little green light that wasn't working.
Yeah.
But they got so caught up in trying to fix it that they didn't notice the autopilot had disengaged, and the plane ended up crashing.
So the problem wasn't the light itself, it was that they lost sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we have to be journalists of our own lives, as the book says. We have to be able to step back and see the forest for the trees.
Okay, so what are some practical ways to develop that skill? The book talks about like keeping a journal and interviewing yourself.
Right. So with journaling, the idea is not to write pages and pages every day. It's about capturing those essential thoughts, the insights that really resonate with you. And then the book suggests going back and reviewing your journal entries every 90 days. It helps you identify patterns, see what's draining your energy, what's really important to you.
It's like a way to check in with yourself to make sure you're on the right track. And interviewing yourself, what's that about?
It's about asking yourself those tough questions, the kind of questions a journalist would ask, like, why am I doing this? What's my motivation? What am I really trying to achieve? The book even suggests putting yourself in someone else's shoes to see your situation from a different perspective. And it also emphasizes the importance of clarifying the question, making sure you're actually asking the right question before you start trying to answer it.
So it's about getting clear on what you're trying to achieve before you dive into action. Okay, so we've talked a lot about focus and discipline, but what about the role of fun and play in essentialism? It almost seems like the opposite, but the book has a whole chapter on play.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As adults, we tend to think of play as frivolous, waste of time. But the book argues that this is a pretty modern perspective. It comes from the Industrial Revolution with its emphasis on efficiency and a very structured approach to work.
But play is actually really important for adults, isn't it?
It is. And there's a lot of research to back that up. The book talks about Stuart Brown's work. He's done a lot of research on the benefits of play. And he found that play is crucial for brain plasticity. It helps us learn and adapt.
Because it's not just about having fun, it's
Yeah.
actually essential for our cognitive abilities.
Exactly. And it also helps with problem solving, creativity, and even our overall well-being. The book quotes Brown saying, play leads to brain plasticity, adaptability, and creativity. And it gives examples of companies that are incorporating play into their culture, like Twitter's improv classes, those brainstorming sessions at IDEO that they do in a vintage microbus. And then, of course, you have the playful office environments at places like Google and Pixar.
Those are all great examples. It's like they're recognizing that playfulness can actually lead to more creativity and innovation.
Right. And the book emphasizes that play isn't just about finding what's essential. It is essential. It's essential for our well-being, our ability to think differently, to connect with others. It even suggests revisiting your childhood play memories and trying to bring some of that back into your adult life. What did you love to do as a kid? Maybe there's a way to recapture some of that joy.
That's a really cool idea. Okay, so play is about protecting our creativity, our well-being. The next chapter is about protecting our physical and mental resources. It's called sleep.
Protect the asset. That's the key idea here.
Hmm.
The book tells this story about Jeff, a really successful CEO who was basically running himself into the ground. He was chronically sleep deprived. And he ignored all the warning signs, thinking he could just power through it. But eventually it caught up with him. He had a major health crisis.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And the book highlights this research on top violinists. They found that the best violinists in the world, they actually sleep significantly more than the average person, like almost an hour more per night.
That's a lot of extra sleep.
It is, but it's not because they're lazy. It's because that extra sleep allows them to recover, to consolidate what they've learned, and to practice with more focus and intensity. And there's a Harvard Business Review article that calls sleep deficit the performance killer. It's true. When you're sleep deprived, you're just not functioning at your best.
And there's even research suggesting that sleep itself can help with problem solving and coming up with new ideas. So sleep is not a luxury. It's essential for high performance.
Okay, we've talked a lot about saying no. The next essentialist principle is select. This is about being selective, not just with our time, but with the people we bring into our lives and organizations.
Yeah, so the book talks about the hiring practices at Vitso, this company that makes shelving systems. They have a very, very rigorous hiring process. They start with phone interviews, so they can't see the person and be influenced by visual biases. And they have these team questionnaires where they ask these really interesting questions like, would he or she love working here, and would we love having him or her work with us? Those are some pretty subjective questions.
They are. But it shows how much they value finding the right people. And they actually prefer to be understaffed rather than hire someone who isn't a good fit.
So it's not just about filling a role, it's about finding people who are aligned with the company's values.
Exactly. And the book also addresses that fear of missing out that we all experience sometimes. That feeling that we have to say yes to every opportunity. And it offers this really helpful tool, the killer question. It's basically this. If I didn't have this opportunity right now, what would I be willing to do to acquire it?
So it's a way to assess how much you really value something.
Right. If you wouldn't be willing to go out of your way to get it, maybe it's not that important after all.
Okay, so we've gotten better at saying no. We're being more selective. Now we need to get really clear about what we're saying yes to, and that's where Clarify comes in, defining our essential intent.
Yeah, so essential intent is about moving beyond those vague mission statements that you see everywhere.
Yeah.
The book contrasts this idea of eliminate hunger in the world, which is a great goal, but it's very broad. And they compare it to Brad Pitt's Make It Right organization. Their intent is to build 150 affordable, green, storm-resistant homes for families living in the lower Ninth Ward.
That's much more specific.
All right, it's concrete, and you can measure it. They know exactly when they've succeeded. And a well-defined essential intent, it acts as a filter for all your decisions.
So it helps you stay focused on what really matters. Now, what about those things we're already committed to that maybe with an essentialist lens we realize aren't so essential anymore? The book talks about uncommit, cutting your losses.
Yeah, winning big by cutting your losses. It's a hard skill to master, but it's important. And the book tells the story of the Concorde jet. It was an amazing feat of engineering, but it was a financial failure.
Why was it a failure?
Well, the book uses it to illustrate this concept called the sunk cost bias. It's that tendency we have to keep investing in something just because we've already invested a lot, even when it's clear it's not working. It's like that person at the casino who keeps feeding money into a slot machine, hoping to win back what they've lost.
Yeah, we've all been there on a smaller scale, sticking with something just because we've already put in so much time or effort.
Exactly. So the essentialist approach to this is to ask yourself, if I weren't already invested in this, how much would I invest in it now? And the book offers a few strategies for uncommitting, like pretend you don't own it yet, so you can remove that emotional attachment. Or be aware of the status quo bias, that tendency we have to just stick with what we're doing.
Mm.
And it even suggests running a reverse pilot, like temporarily stop doing something to see what the impact is.
So it's like a low-risk way to test the waters. Okay, so another important part of protecting our time and energy is setting boundaries. And the book offers this really simple but powerful piece of advice. No is a complete sentence.
It's so true. And there's this story about this woman named Jin Young. She surprised her manager by just straight up saying no to an extra project right before her wedding. No explanations, no apologies, just no. And her team was totally fine with it.
So it shows that sometimes just being direct is the best approach.
Right. And the book also talks about this idea of crafting social contracts. Like when you're working on a project with others, having those conversations up front about priorities, boundaries, expectations. That way everyone's on the same page, and you can avoid a lot of wasted time and conflict down the road.
Okay, so we've identified the essentials, we've uncommitted from the non-essentials, we're setting boundaries. Now, how do we make the actual execution of those essential things feel effortless? The book talks about the principle of buffer.
Yeah, buffer is about building in padding into your plans, like recognizing that things almost always take longer than we expect. The book talks about the planning fallacy, that tendency we have to underestimate how long things will take. So the idea is to add like a 50% buffer to your time estimates. It just gives you more breathing room, less stress.
It's like anticipating the unexpected so you're not constantly scrambling.
Exactly. And then there's the power of routine. Routine basically makes difficult things easier by strengthening those neural pathways in your brain. The book gives the example of Michael Phelps's pre-race routine, those specific steps he always takes to get himself into a peak state of performance.
So it's not just about being rigid, it's about creating a structure that helps you perform at your best.
Right. And the book explains the habit loop cue routine reward. And it suggests ways to overhaul your triggers, to change bad habits and build better ones. And it also talks about how Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, he themes different days of the week for different types of work. It's a way to maintain some variety while still having the benefits of routine.
So you can have structure without getting bored. Okay, so the last principle in the book is focus, being present in the moment.
Yeah, and this is about understanding the difference between chronos and kairos. Chronos is like clock time, linear time. But kairos is about those opportune moments, those times when you're really engaged and time seems to disappear.
So it's about quality of time, not just quantity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book tells this story where McKeown was feeling overwhelmed after a long day of teaching, and he had to stop and ask himself, what's important now? It's about prioritizing the present moment instead of always thinking about the past or the future.
And the book offers some practical tips for doing this, like figure out what's most important right now. Get those future to-dos out of your head by writing them down. And practice single tasking instead of trying to do a million things at once.
Right. It's all about being mindful and present so you can focus on what's truly essential in each moment.
Okay, so we've gone through the whole process of essentialism, from choosing what matters to making its execution effortless. The last principle in the book is B. It's like bringing it all together.
Yeah. B is about living an essentialist life. It's about integrating these principles into your identity. And the book gives a lot of examples, historical figures who embrace simplicity, like Gandhi, religious figures like Buddha and Jesus. And then, of course, you have people like Steve Jobs and Thoreau.
And Thoreau, he had that great quote about simplifying life, right?
Yeah, he said, simplify the problem of life, distinguish the necessary and the real. It's a good reminder that this isn't just about productivity hacks. It's about living a more intentional life.
It's about aligning your actions with your values. And the book comes back to that paradox of success. It says that essentialism is a way out of that feeling of being spread too thin, of not making the impact you want to make.
And it emphasizes that focusing on the essentials is a choice. It's your choice. And recognizing that can be really powerful. McKeown talks about how he knew that going to Stanford for grad school was the essential path for him. And he had to say no to other opportunities that were tempting, but ultimately not as aligned with his goals.
So it's about having the courage to say no even when it's hard.
Right. And the book ends by saying that becoming an essentialist is a journey. It's not something you achieve overnight, but it's a journey worth taking.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into essentialism, the core message is this: do less, but do it better. Focus on those few things that really matter. We've talked about choice, trade-offs, boundaries, being present. And as you think about how these ideas apply to your own life, ask yourself this: what's one non-essential commitment you can let go of this week? What's the big picture in your life that really deserves your attention?
Those are great questions to consider. We really encourage you to think about these ideas, to experiment, to see what works for you.
Because ultimately, it's about creating a life that's more meaningful, more impactful, and less overwhelming. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the podcast is to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every bit of support helps us keep creating content that actually matters. See you in the next one.